All right. What's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforesight.com. And so basically, we have two new speeches, one from each of the new Fed governors. I don't remember when the last one started, but this one we're going over now. The new governor, Philip N. Jefferson, he started in, I think it's May 23rd. Yeah, May 23rd, 2022. So this year, a few months ago. But this is his first speech, right? It's basically about mostly like technology and its impact on the American economy, especially in the past couple years with the pandemic and everything. So, how exactly has the economy changed? Most explicitly with supply chains, businesses, payment systems, that sort of thing, right? And so, it's a bit of a shorter speech, but still pretty, we'll say on point, I guess. But with that being said, we will head over to the screen share so you guys can see the speech as well. And this one does have a watch live link if you guys want to actually watch it and listen to it. So there's that as well. So to get right into it, supply chain and business investment underwent and are still experiencing significant change. Large increases in computers and peripheral investment enabled remote work and helped to automate processes at physical establishments while simultaneously minimizing in-person contact. So that's one thing that you can definitely see as a I think it's a positive, but that's kind of my own personal point of view in terms of kind of one of the outcomes of the pandemic in general was how basically businesses and the economy in general really automated in a certain way, or at least we'll say streamlined processes because there was a much more significant incentive to do so, right? And so there's that sort of thing side of things in a way. And so now, with the whole minimizing in-person contact, and given the situation at the time, yeah, of course, it makes sense that was. I'd probably say that's a positive, especially when no one really understood what was going on in the very beginning. I don't want to say no one, but the vast majority of people will say were unsure. Um, but regardless, also getting more into a more I guess now more applicable situation or topic, concept, whatever, meaning the labor market. So it showed great adaptability and the rapidity and relative ease that many sectors showed in shifting to remote work, which is a trend that's supposedly still going on. Maybe kind of reverting back to where people are kind of having to go back to the office to a certain degree, obviously depending on the job and what they do exactly. But it really kind of shows, especially with the whole remote work thing, what exactly like, especially if you're like a small business or something, it showed that there's not really too much of a necessity, or at least you always have the option to do stuff more remotely, right? To where you're not as landlocked, depending on your business, of course, or it really kind of depends. Especially if you're moving like physical products, you can't obviously you can't really move products in terms of warehousing, like the physical actually moving of the products and stuff onto trucks and that sort of thing. At least as of right now, to my knowledge, from a computer, unless you kind of have some form of machine or whatever that automatically sorts and puts it on trucks. But regardless, that kind of thing. But the biggest part, especially with the whole going remote, and I have a lot of personal experience with this explicitly, was the whole remote and hybrid learning, right? Mostly because I was in 2020 when everything started happening. I was in my junior year of college, and so I kind of experienced that firsthand and saw a lot of the, we'll say, pros and cons, and leave it nicely, of that whole experience. And so the shift to remote work and hybrid learning, however, was difficult, but without technology, learning during lockdown might have ceased entirely. Unfortunately, most people wouldn't really actively learn by themselves. They have to be kind of pushed via school, which is unfortunate. And I say most people, um, or at least from my experience, especially with younger people around my age ish and probably lower as well. So, in some cases, schools were closed for only a few weeks or months, and the entire in-person learning apparatus was replaced with technology-enabled remote learning, which not necessarily, I'll say it was better than nothing, but it's still like could have been applied differently. Like it's definitely completely different and you don't get nearly as much out of it as in-person learning. And the thing that's kind of irritating with that it was mostly with tuition and stuff, just kind of from personal experience of how like tuition stayed the same even though you weren't getting the same amount of education, right? And that's not particularly, that seems more of an on professor basis. At least it was for me because it really depended on who the professor was, just to kind of be honest. But regardless, it really just depends. And it, from my understanding and from the people I've talked to, granted, it's all anecdotal evidence, so that's kind of take it with a grain of salt. But that was pretty much the consensus view from my peers at the time was it wasn't that great. Um, but you didn't have to travel to school or class. So that's pretty much like the only positive that comes to mind right now. But anyways, retooling the curriculum for the hybrid environment, student services also had to change to accommodate the increased need for childcare and other pandemic related hurdles, or the school risk a drop of enrollment, which we did see, and I believe we saw personally. Personally, I'm talking about my university that I was going to, was a significant drop of enrollment during this period. Um, Obviously don't have exact numbers on that. That was more of just what we were kind of told and we kind of heard from that sort of that section of the campus, we'll say. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But we did see and actually started hearing about, like we started to actually get emails about childcare and that sort of thing. Um, because we did have quite a large non-traditional student population of where I went. So that was there as well. Other things that you really saw kind of take off was like curbside pickup became the norm. And you can understand that, especially I think this is really when I started, like whenever I would go to Walmart and stuff, they had like that designated pickup area to where like you would just pull your car in, they had parking spots and all of that. I don't remember if that was kind of in its infancy before March of 2020 or if it really started to take off after. So I don't know if it was just a trend that got accelerated by the pandemic or if it was just kind of in response to is where I'm kind of going with that. So there's that. And then there's the remote payments. I'm pretty sure this was actually in development beforehand. Um, just because I've always had a chip in my card pretty much ever since I got it in the first place, when I first got my bank account. And don't remember if tap to pay was always a thing. I know the new one has it, like where it's built in or whatever, but I think you had like the ones on your phone, like Samsung Pay or whatever it is, or Google Pay, I think is the other one, and Apple Pay. So yeah, each one kind of has their own thing, but regardless. And that's because in-person use fell. And mostly also this is stuff like Cash App started growing really big. So growing prominence of person-to-person money transfer apps provided consumers with remote and touchless cash substitutes in their daily lives. So I know like before the pandemic and everything, I didn't even have these apps. Even though like I'm kind of in that age demographic, I just never used them. And so I never had one. And it was really that was kind of the incentive for me to get it, not to really kind of skirt away from person to person interaction because that's just kind of my own personal point of view. That's not really necessary to disclose, I guess. But just kind of the lifestyle I live. And mostly the biggest part of this is when I started working, because I basically work as a contractor. And so I have a lot of travel for work, right? And so whenever we split hotel rooms a lot because we go as crews. And so whenever we split hotel rooms, it just makes it so much easier to use a Cash App or a Venmo or whatever, because then we don't have to like go to the ATM wherever we happen to be that week and pull out cash or that sort of thing. It's just easier. So there's that as well. So, and this kind of rolls us into his economic outlook, right? Which is a lot shorter than the other ones, especially shorter than his contemporary, who's new, which is not really because they come in pairs. The new Fed governor, I think her name is Lisa. I forgot which exact Fed she goes to now, or she's a part of. But Mr. Jefferson is for the Atlanta Fed. So there's that. But his outlook, the labor market remains strong, as can be seen across a variety of measures from the low unemployment rate to the high quits rate, which illustrates the confidence of workers who are willing to leave their jobs in pursuit of better ones. Labor force participation remains lower than it was prior to the pandemic, reflecting several factors, including people who left the workforce for early retirement and some remaining parents and other caregivers who stayed home through the pandemic. These are not factors that reverse on a dime, right? So I don't know. Again, just anecdotal. Like I understand the whole early retirement thing. That one, there's some personal experience with people I know, but with the remaining parents and other caregivers still staying home, I'm not quite sure how applicable that is. But again, that's purely based off of anecdotal evidence because I just don't know anyone who's still doing that, or who really ever did that. Really, I think everyone kind of figured something out, but again, that's purely from the people I know personally and purely anecdotal. So take that as you wish. That being said, also one kind of comment I've started to notice as I started going over all of these Fed member speeches, this is what I call them. Basically, the speeches given by Fed governors, they're kind of all talk about the same thing, like in terms of their outlook. And I guess I don't know if that's just because of the time of the kind of current environment that we're seeing economically and monetarily, I guess. Um, Mostly because the FOMC seems to be very unified in that respect. And that's really, I don't know if you'd say that's kind of a reflection of Jay Powell or what. But again, they all kind of have the same point of view, or especially with the economic outlooks, they're all, I'll say, significantly similar in term, and they quote the same data all the time. And this one doesn't. Mr. Jefferson, or Governor Jefferson, whatever you want to call him now, doesn't really give specific numbers like you typically see. And like there's no references at the end of it, which is fine. It's his first speech, and that's not really, especially the topic of the speech. Like this isn't talking bad about him whatsoever. I'm kind of just saying and want to point out that I don't notice these things in his speech, but it's also like his doesn't really, it doesn't seem to be a requirement for his topic that he's giving the speech about. So how applicable throw it have to go out of his way to introduce like actual statistics just because, especially the whole title, technology's impact on the post-pandemic economy. Now granted, I could definitely see where some statistics could be used, but it seems like it's rather easy to make it just kind of a qualitative speech, I'll say, to where it's mostly just you don't need the statistics, right? It's just kind of more of a general point of view to kind of learn who he is, especially as his first speech. So I can kind of see that. But I don't know. It's just a comment I wanted to make because normally they have statistics in there, but it's also like he's got what 14 years, so at least on the board. But yeah. So, in a market with more job openings than workers, the competition to fill vacancies is leading to rapid wage gains now, and the resulting salary compression may lead to further upward wage pressures in the future. So, I'm assuming it's basically like because people have been, or what people generally do in concept, and they seem to be kind of bringing up multiple times with the data they're exposing is basically like after a specific time, or I won't say specific, but after a certain amount of time, whatever that is for you, it's definitely a good idea to try to kind of like hop to a different corporation or like a different company, right? Doing whatever you do, just because it's easier to get a larger wage increase or salary increase if you go to a different company, right? Rather than staying intrinsically or staying within the same company. It just seems like there's less hurdles to jump over to get the same rate, right? Because it's just like there's a lot you don't have to really give that argument of like this is why you should pay me more relative to what you already have when you're going to a new corporation because they don't have any kind of previous data from them on you. Like they don't you're new, right? And so it's just easier, I guess, to get that higher wage. And that's something that you just kind of do, I guess, every so often, especially if where you are isn't going to offer you further development. At least that's how I think about it, especially with personal do for a living. Right now, especially, like it's just constant, like, and development and learning and everything. Whoops. And so it's like I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. But it's like if that stops, it's kind of like after a certain amount of period, it's like, okay, I'm not really content and just kind of sitting here being the same. Like I want to continuously learn more. That's why I did this work in the first place. And so, yeah. Anyways, I guess completely off topic, somewhat. But yeah. So, and then kind of going back on supply chains a little bit, he says we have already seen some indications that from survey data, information from transportation hubs and producer prices that supply bottlenecks have at long last begun to resolve. So hopefully that'll start to ease things up and help get stuff flowing more, I guess I'll say readily throughout the economy because that's something you need to keep in mind. And then basically ties this into inflation. So basically, the whole taking it back down to the 2% target is pretty much it, restoring price stability. And he says this will likely entail a period of below trend growth. So we'll see with 2 quarters of negative GDP, but the third one seems to be rather positive, or at least as it was estimated by the Atlanta Fed, because they have like that GDP now indicator or whatever it is, whatever they call it. It's GDP now something, but basically their estimate of each quarter's GDP or real GDP. And so last time it was in the twos, like handle on there, but still, and yeah, the third quarter's over, but it's like it's a week or so it takes time to get this stuff out. So kind of to conclude in a way, it is too soon to say whether the pandemic and the changes it brought, many of which this conference has covered, are going to be permanent or ebb away as time goes. His guess is that it is likely to be a combination of the two, with some features becoming embedded, such as new approaches to working on contactless payment, and others returning to something like they were before, like the preference for in-person education. That is definitely a preference because you don't learn very much, at least on a relative basis, um, online, right? You just don't get the same interaction, and it's much harder to get that. It takes the whole experience out of, I'll say specifically post secondary education, because that's where I was at the time. Um, it just takes the whole experience out of it. Like, that's the whole reason you kind of go to college. Because honestly, like, pretty much most of college, especially the classes themselves, is basically a professor telling you to read certain sections of the book and then you just kind of learn it on your own anyway. Yes, you can ask questions and stuff, but it's still like there's that. It's the interactions with the professors, the other students in the lab, whatever it is, that really kind of make it worth it if that's the route you're going, right? And so without that, it's kind of pointless to do it, in my opinion, or at least that's what it seemed like, right? It just it was completely not worth the time nor investment in that respect, right? To do it completely online, right? Especially if everything else was to remain the same, specifically the cost, because it's like the kind of, why would you pay for the same? Why would you pay the same if you're not getting nearly the same outcome, right? It's, you just don't learn that way, especially it's the experiences. That's one of the things. I don't know if it's just kind of my point of view, and sorry for the kind of closing tangent. Not sorry for it, whatever. Um, it's like the whole point of going to college is to gain that experience, right? And that's really how you learn. It's not so much the sitting in the classes, that kind of stuff is, to my, just read a book, right? That's pretty much all you're doing anyway. I mean, this stuff you can just go on YouTube and Google everything. I mean, literally like 90% of the research I did was going through Google Scholar or one of the databases or whatever, through the library to find peer-reviewed articles and that sort of thing. Like even that, it's like you can just use Google Scholar or something like that and go that route. But it's like, what's the point if you're not getting the actual experience doing it? And it's like, it's kind of like the whole different degrees. Like if you're going into some form of STEM, like I did, then like engineering, math, physics, chemistry, whatever, um, then university is kind of, from my experience, what is the best way to gain that experience, because you don't really get that. There's not a big way or prominent way to gain that experience that really kind of develops you into whatever field you're trying to get into, like being in the lab. Also use that as an explicit example. So it's like if you want to be a physicist, then you need to get into a physics lab and do physics things, right? That's what you need to do things to learn them. Just reading them, you don't really get it so much. It's not really until you actually do things to which you actually fully understand it. And that kind of gets into the whole difference between knowing something and understanding something, because there is a difference, right? Just because you know blank, you don't really understand it until you do it, right? You otherwise it's just kind of a phrase you memorize in your head, it seems. There's kind of a concept, yes, and you can kind of theorize, but it's also like, unless you can actually use that for something, it's basically just space in your head, more or less. And so it's like, what's the point? Whereas like if you're going to something else and to another route, well, I'll say kind of more of a artistic way of life, in a way. Like if we're going into like journalism or something, something of that nature, it's kind of just seems more beneficial to you if you were to just kind of like intern at a newspaper than sit in an English class. And like, yeah, you're writing and doing all this stuff, but why not actually go somewhere like that and just be like, hey, can I intern with you for like a year or two, or maybe even just do it on the weekends or something, and gain that experience, those connections, and that sort of thing, to go that route, right? You can go that route, or you can gain that experience without necessarily going to college, right? You don't have to, but especially at what they're wanting for tuition nowadays. Whereas, like, you don't really get to go, or you don't really have an opportunity to get into those conferences in like the STEM field unless it's through some institution, typically. And it just, from my experience, that seems to be the best route to get there. But, and the whole time of me explaining this, I completely forgot to switch screens. So that's why I do these. Like, I don't retake these at all. I just kind of do them. But, anyways, just because I want you guys to see the mistakes and that sort of thing, just because it's not going to be perfect. So, anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. So, sorry for my little tangent at the end. But, anyways, I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.